Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Sensitivity Doctor. Today, I have part 2 of my interview with Molly Duncan from Tattoos of My Soul and All in Nutritions. She is an amazing life coach and spiritual teacher and supporter of those who have undergone trauma. Her story, her harrowing story of survival from a potential shooting, is in episode 119, that actually dropped this very day that I interviewed her again. Today, we touched on the parts that we didn't get to that were so important to us about generational trauma. I loved this conversation. If you're someone who's undergone trauma and you don't know exactly how to stop the cycle, this episode is for you. We talk about what to say and what not to say to your kids, how to model healing, how to handle resilience and toxic resilience, which I had not heard of before, and how to really lean into post-traumatic growth. So if you're looking for how to heal yourself and your family, please listen in, share this episode, rate this episode, help others in your family and others who have undergone generational trauma, fight the cycle, heal, and move forward. Enjoy. Now, here we are, part 2, talking about what I don't think we really got to touch on last time, which is how trauma ripples through families and the impact that generational trauma can have. And so before we dig into the present, I was curious if we could look a little bit at your past. And I was just asking if there's any experiences you've had with generational trauma personally.
Yeah, sure. I think that, I mean, I think all families probably have a layer of that to some degree. Some families are going to have it more intense than others. When I think of my own personal family, the thing that really sticks out to me is I had an uncle, it was my mom's brother, who passed away when he was 42 years old, which is how old I am, which, when I reached this age, that was one of the first things I was like, man, that was how old he was when he passed. We were very close. And he had about 20 years of health issues leading up to his passing. He got diagnosed with cancer in his early 20s and just was, ill really the rest of his life and died from complications of a liver and heart transplant
Oh, wow.
at 42. But I witnessed my grandparents deal with that trauma, the loss of their child. And they did the best they could. They're no longer living. They did the best they could, but their way of dealing with it was numbing, and alcoholism runs in my family. And I just watched the effect the toll that took on them individually, on our family. It just was like, again, they did the best that they could. And I feel like they probably felt like they were dealing with it. But now, as I kind of step back and I'm an adult, I was in my mid 20s when he passed. So I was an adult then, but I'm an older and
Not
wiser
fully
adult, I
cooked.
guess. Yeah. I guess I'm fully cooked now or getting there. But yeah, I just think, what would their have life look like if they would have had better tools to heal? Honestly, I feel like they might still be here because alcoholism, ended up being part of their demise and led to a lot of health issues. And so I know that that's within my family. It's something that I've spoken about. I feel like we don't want to talk about these things, but how do we prevent the next generation from just
Right.
recreating these patterns, and honestly, I said in the first episode, that was something that I kind of initially turned to, not even really realizing it, just having a glass of wine or two or three in the evening, and I remember it getting earlier and earlier throughout the day that I had that urge. And again, it was during COVID, it was lockdown, and I think a lot of people struggled with that, but
Yeah.
it was definitely a coping mechanism. And I'm very, very thankful that I was able to see that pattern that was happening. And if I didn't stop it, it could have caused me more of an issue. But yeah, I think that that's something I've seen in my own family and something
Yeah.
that I'm aware of and careful of.
When you had that moment where you realized, okay, I think this is problematic, was it for you personally, did it feel like it was kind of a quick decision or was it a gradual journey towards not
Yeah.
using, I don't know if you've heard of internal family systems. It's this method of therapy and this theory that sees us as multiple parts. and that we're
Okay.
not just this one. And if you look in different realms of spirituality and religion, this is called different things like the soul or the self or higher power or all of this. And when we're not leading with the self or the soul or the higher power, all these other names for it, and there's parts of us making decisions on our behalf, they're doing it like the part of you that wanted you to go get a glass of wine most likely also wanted you to feel better. Like that, it's like their best interest is to help you, but
Sure.
the way it comes across and what it actually does for you is usually not helpful. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm curious if does that like connect for you at all? Like, did you when you think back on it, is there a way that you're able to kind of feel that part of you as opposed to when you had that moment like, oh, this is a problem? It sounds to me like that was like a center self soul higher power moment.
Yeah. I mean, I remember feeling before I really got to the point of knowing I needed to shift gears and do the work that I had been avoiding. I remember having thoughts like, this is not the healthiest. Again, it was when I found myself looking at the clock each day and being like, because 5 o'clock. So
Somewhere.
I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's how many more hours? I remember having this thought. How many more hours until it's okay to have
Right.
a glass of wine? And I remember immediately thinking, like the higher self saying, that's not healthy. You shouldn't be counting
Yeah.
down the hours until you can have a glass of wine because that's what's taking the edge off for you. If you have an
Right.
edge, maybe you need to go do some work to properly deal with it. So I absolutely remember having that, but at that point, I think I was still too like raw and still just
Yeah.
honestly, you kind of get in survival mode and you don't necessarily want to look at the trauma. You're not necessarily ready. And what I have found out through myself and through also like, because I'm a life coach and so I work with a lot of people on one-on-one, I've realized that we humans are really hard-headed sometimes.
We certainly
And
can be. That's a good
yeah.
point.
And we sometimes won't do the work until it's literally like you have to do the work. And even though I had those thoughts of this is not healthy, you're not dealing with this the way you should be, I remember just validating and pushing that aside. And it wasn't until my husband and I came to that breaking point in our marriage where everything kind of just capitulated. And
Yeah.
I realized this suppression is not healthy. There's a lot of things underneath that we are not dealing with.
Yeah.
And I'm either going to have to face the truth and go do this work and try and heal myself and then hopefully heal our marriage, or my life as I know it is going to continue to crumble, and that initial trauma is literally going to just obliterate the rest of my life. I need to
Yeah.
that's not I don't want to let that happen,
Right. It
so
it almost makes me think of when I think of people who are living right now trying to do the work around their generational trauma. It's not just because you're working on the trauma doesn't mean that you feel light and easy and breezy. Like it's not necessarily an easy thing. But have you seen that there's this really good visual about generational trauma? I've seen it. It was a little bit of a trend. I think it's already kind of disappeared, but with the dirty water glasses, have you seen it?
I feel like I am familiar with this, but
It's
remind me.
such a beautiful visual. So there's this, set of glasses where there's dirty, just imagine like muddy water. So under the thing it says grandmother, and then it pours in and it says mother, and she's pouring her dirty water into that cup. And the next one says you, and then she pours it into the cup. And then the next one is there's an empty cup that says your child. And then out of the frame comes this glass, not a glass, a pitcher of clean water. And then the figure starts dumping the clean water into your dirty glass, and it's going everywhere. Like it's a mess. And it
Yeah.
almost looks like this metaphor for what tears and crying and all of this looks like. And it's just flooding the whole scene. And then all of a sudden, finally, it's clear. And then eventually the figure picks up your glass, which is now clean, and puts it into the child's glass.
Wow. Yeah. No,
So good.
that's a very good analogy. Yes. Yes.
So when you think about the work you have done and probably still are doing, honestly,
Yeah.
like every day, it's a decision. What parts of it were difficult for you? Like what parts do you find difficult in overcoming generational trauma? And I don't think enough people talk about this. What parts are positive and freeing and like uplifting? Because there's got to be a, a yin to the yang kind of thing.
For sure. Yeah. I think the parts that are difficult, and if I think about generational trauma and just like, all the layers that a lot of people's families have, it seems to me, I'm not an expert in this field, but it seems to me like people just don't want to talk about the hard things. So we don't talk about it. We have this thing that happened in our family, or we had this situation that happened, and it's easier just to kind of go on and act like all is well when it's
Right.
not. And I absolutely found myself doing that initially because I did not, and I even said this in the first episode, I didn't want to talk about what had happened to us. I didn't want to answer questions. I didn't want to get I remember people's facial expression when they would, and I still get it, but it doesn't bother me
Yeah.
now because I've done the
Right.
work. But they would just kind of like give me this, oh my
Like
gosh,
shock.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just, I didn't want any of that. I didn't want any of that attention or those questions. And it was easier for me to pretend, as crazy as that sounds, like it didn't happen. And if it did come up, I would try and change the subject. And I think that this is really at the cusp of how you have trauma just bleed into generation after generation after generation because
Right.
people it is easier. I totally get it. I empathize. They don't want to talk about the hard things. They don't want to talk about the uncomfortable feelings. And so we cope the best we can. And so that's the part that's difficult is
Yeah.
finally coming to terms with talking about the really, really hard, uncomfortable parts. But that's just the necessary part. You have to go through that in order to get to the other side. The
Right.
positive part, in my opinion, is the freedom that comes when you stop avoiding
Yes.
the situation that's so painful, the actual inner freedom, the soul freedom, whatever you want to call that just comes from like, hey, this is not this big scary thing anymore. Yes, I would never choose this. I wish it wouldn't have happened, but it did happen. It's part of my life. It's part of my story. And instead of being ashamed of it or sad or bitter or whatever, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to try and learn from it. And there is true freedom and also strength in that. I can honestly say I like myself as a person much more now than before going through this. Really
Well, that's some
interesting.
post-traumatic growth if I've ever heard any.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I'm happy that I can say that because I have qualities, I have skills now, in particular my ability to empathize with other people who are going through hard things. Like I feel like I've always been somewhat empathetic, probably just on an
Right.
average level, but I think when you go through your own trauma, when you're talking to others, even if their situation is completely different,
Yeah.
it's like, man, the symptoms of your pain, I recognize, like I felt that. Like I understand what it feels like just to be at a complete loss and just to not even know how to take a step forward. Like I know that feeling. And
Yeah.
I'm glad I know that feeling because I'm able to connect with people in a whole
Right.
different way now. So,
You
yeah.
brought up so many good points. One good point actually having to do with sensitivity, and then I wanted to jump over to your excellent points about what I like to call open authentic honesty. Open authentic honesty. It's like flexing that muscle all the time, anytime you can. And for anyone who has gone through generational trauma, like what you're explaining, or your own trauma and you know, the past messages, sweep it under the rug or don't talk about it, or if you don't talk about it, it won't be an issue. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a couple things with that. First and foremost, research shows that when we just name our experience, the distress that we experience reduces on average by 50%.
Wow.
Right. And so I have so many of my clients, honestly, who just think that this is crazy. Like they've literally said, what's the point of me talking about it?
Yeah.
It's not going to change anything. But it's really truly evident that when you name it, your body doesn't have to do so much work to repress it, because repression is a form of hyperprocessing. I don't think people understand that the not telling is so exhausting for
Oh,
whatever
yeah.
that might be. And so open, authentic honesty, it's like repeating it over and over. It doesn't just show up in talking about the trauma. It can also show up in other areas of life. So let's say hypothetically, it's a very common example. You forget to take the trash out. And maybe this is something that is your job in the house and you always seem to forget to take the trash out. So your partner or your spouse comes to you and they bring it up. The initial flood of shame that can come over you of, oh man, I've been found. I've been caught
Yeah.
again forgetting. If you've had generational trauma, especially complex trauma in a family, you'll be more likely
Hmm.
to kind of knee-jerk react by covering up your mess ups, because this is like a perpetuated way of expressing what's on our mind, expressing our shame, expressing our mistakes, expressing things that, because when we look at trauma, a lot of times one of the illogical thoughts connected to trauma is placement of blame on the person who experienced it. So by doing
Right.
what you're saying, Molly, by unfolding and not keeping it under the rug and just being open, authentic, and honest, the hope is that you can be practicing this in other areas of your life as well, because it will make it
Hmm.
easier to work through generational trauma in general, if that makes sense. I'm curious
Sure.
if
Yeah.
that's something you've ever experienced or you've noticed in your own journey.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that you said like the person that experiences the trauma will take on blame for it, because in a really weird way, I felt that
Yeah.
with the shooting, and I would even say to people, not that I blamed myself, I just felt almost kind of embarrassed of the situation,
Yeah.
and here's why. I felt like for the average person, kind of the outsider looking in, looking at our life, I thought, man, our life looks like a total wreck, like a mess. And in particular, as a mom, that really ate away at me because I felt like other families in the community, my kids' friends, their parents, like, oh my gosh, those poor kids, look at what their mom's life has brought into their life. These were a
Yeah.
lot of the thoughts that I had
Right.
and more. And so, yeah, I obviously didn't like cause this to happen, but I took
Right.
on a lot of shame and even guilt for like the repercussions of it 100%. And I think the biggest thing I can say about generational trauma from my experience is because I consider my childhood very healthy, very happy. I had great parents, I had a great home life. I didn't have any like trauma per se in my own family experience, except for what I witnessed with my grandparents and the trauma of my uncle's premature death and kind of how they handled it. I think I recognize patterns from my family that I absolutely could have slipped into that would have intensified my trauma and made it something that would have been really hard to deal with, and the main pattern is what we've been talking about, not talking about it, not, and I think this is very common in a lot of families. We have crazy, unfortunate, hard things happen and we don't know how to process, and we do the best we can with what we know, and we grab at whatever coping mechanism is available, and sometimes those coping tools are not healthy ones and they make
Yeah.
everything worse, and then you just keep
Hmm.
stacking layer upon layer. You know what I'm saying?
Right. I do. And
Yeah.
you're bringing up basically the issue of resilience. If
Yeah.
and what I mean by that is, so one example I talk a lot about, honestly, with some of my clients, because I work with quite a few veterans, is that when you have someone who goes into a situation where they are potentially going to be traumatized, I mean, many of them are going into war. If they don't enter into these scenarios already having resilience patterns around open expression of feelings, asking for help, using self care, using rest, like these things are not encouraged in the culture of the military. They're just not. And there's an effort to work on it and there's light shining on this. But when you think about having someone who already doesn't have resilience patterns or is not being encouraged to, then experiencing a trauma,
Yeah.
and then even sometimes not being encouraged to name the trauma, because if they do, then they can be targeted. You can see how that can transfer into families too,
Oh, yeah.
where maybe to your point, it doesn't paint the picture that culturally the family believes in or wants to paint about that family. So this is exactly to your point, that if you're
Yeah.
already not going in with resilience patterns and then a trauma happens.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. It's just that compounding effect.
absolutely.
Have you heard of toxic resilience? Have you heard of that?
No, do
Yeah. Okay.
tell. I love when there's like
So
a pop psych
a
term
little
I haven't
spin.
heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I just read about this. So I'm reading a book right now that I really am enjoying. It's just really interesting. It's called The Five Resets. You
Okay.
may have heard about it.
I
It's
haven't.
Dr. I'm totally going to say her name wrong. Aditi, I think is her
Oh, I
first
know who you're
name.
talking about,
Do you know
actually.
who I'm speaking?
And I think
Okay.
you said it right.
Okay, great. I was like, I'm gonna butcher this. But she talks about resilience and how it actually becomes toxic in our minds because we have this productivity, keep going at all cost, push past boundaries, kind of the Energizer Bunny kind of, mindset where we just say, I've got to keep going. If I feel tired, if I feel beat down, if I feel traumatized or hurt or whatever, I don't basically kind of don't have time. Like I'm just going to keep going because,
Right,
the world that we live in, it's fast paced. It's always about the next biggest thing and
right,
accomplishing and, status and all those things. And that can really create a mindset of, I don't have time to deal with this. A strong person shouldn't have to deal with this. Like I should be able to just push through. And I absolutely identified with that when I read it. I was like, I have been toxic. I've had toxic resilience.
like toxically, productively resilient.
There you go. I was trying to figure
Yeah,
out how to
yeah.
say that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's probably
Um,
not even a great sentence either.
but I was like, wow, that's really interesting because we do want to be resilient. Resilience, very positive term, right? But of course, like anything, it can have its limit. And we do
Right.
have to be able to kind of take a step back and allow ourselves to rest and process and ask for help. That that's an important step.
Oh, absolutely. And if you think about resilience, if I almost would encourage anyone listening to think of rest first. Because, like you said, the propensity to, when you were saying that, it was making me think of the four types of trauma responses. We have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And that flight mode, which is what you were
Yeah.
just describing, I mean, if you think about the origins of that, let's imagine you're in a family structure where there's just insidious trauma, there's something going on under the radar that you don't understand, and it can feel a whole lot easier to stay busy.
Oh
It can
yeah.
feel a whole lot easier. And actually, I'm thinking as a clinician, this even comes up sometimes if I'm working with someone who's not ready to leave their partner because it takes a long time to like finally make that happen in a
Sure.
lot of
Yeah.
relationships.
Hmm.
I'm like, are we doing toxic resilience? Because sometimes I'm asking them, go out into the world, find your people, stay busy, find yourself. So it does sound like it's this really precarious balancing act
Yeah.
behind being busy enough where you feel fulfilled and you feel intact with yourself, but not to the point where you're avoiding
Hmm.
rest. And
Right.
then that open, authentic honesty we're talking about, where you can
Yes.
kind of like get with yourself. So, how did you deal with that? And how do you deal with that now? Because I can imagine, and I relate to you in this. I feel like sometimes is it my neurodiversity? Is it generational trauma? Like, what is driving my desire to get up and go do 10 things?
Yeah.
How do you manage that? Like, what do you do when you feel that? Because to me, it feels like an antsiness.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I think that this is all a process, right? And you said a little while ago, you're probably still working, and I 100% am. I think I'll be working on myself until the end of my life. At least that's my my promise to myself is to
Yeah.
continue to do the work.
Well, and otherwise life
Even
would be a little boring.
Well, yeah, right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's needed because healing is not linear, and we know we ebb
Right.
and flow. And I even found myself like last week, I was just struggling mentally. Like nothing really happened. I feel like I was a
Yeah.
little overwhelmed, a little stressed, a little fatigued,
Right.
and I just found myself kind of with that mental heaviness. And it's kind of like now that I've done a good amount of work and I do recognize, hey, you're starting to feel that antsiness. You're starting to feel kind of internally spun up,
Yeah.
that edginess, that reacting a lot quicker. Okay, what is the cause of that? I feel like I've
Right.
gotten better at being more aware of the signs and symptoms of my unhealthy self. And when I feel those things come on, knowing the tools to tap into. So self-care is so important in this healing process, and it's not
Right.
something that's one and done. You have to continually implement time to take care of yourself. And I feel like in our society, when we say self-care, people think of like spa days and meals, and that's all great and fine. Like I
Right.
enjoy that as well. But I'm not talking about that kind of self-care. I'm talking about the kind of self-care that brings me into homeostasis, that allows my mind to quiet down, that allows me to be the healthiest and best version of myself. That is absolutely essential for this resilience piece because, you know, we're both, you've got a business, we've got a business, there's a
Yeah.
lot to do and you can get out of balance really quickly. And
Especially when
that,
you're passionate about your work.
yes,
And there's really no office hours.
no.
No.
Well, especially when you live on the same property as your business.
Yes, for sure.
So, yeah, we live and work all within the same place. And so,
Right.
absolutely, gotta, I think it's being aware of the behaviors, the reactions. I can even tell, like, my thoughts. My thoughts will just start to get a little
Yeah.
bit more negatively based,
Right.
fatigue. All those things are signs that, hey, it's time for a little bit of a reset. You need to take a step back. It's good to be busy, good to push yourself, but at the same time, again, we need balance.
I like if you think about, you were saying this notion about self care being almost an extravagance, but really what you're describing is self regulation. And, for anyone who, I've worked with folks before who really, really cringe at the idea of putting themselves first because they weren't encouraged to do that as children and they didn't have it modeled. And so sometimes I'll have to kind of twist their focus so that we almost trick them into still caring about themselves, but in a way that lands better with their narrative script. So
Yeah,
they might decide, okay, I'm not going to put myself first, but I'm going to do this for myself so I can dot, dot, dot. Like, so I can be a good mother, so I can be a good coworker, so I can be a good friend. So it's almost like they have to externalize the
yeah,
ability to put themselves first. And so I'm thinking with this, if anyone cringes or thinks self care is bougie, if they, or they don't deserve it, which everyone absolutely does, even just reframing it to, I need to practice some self regulation right now. It can kind of,
absolutely.
right? Like it's
Yep.
the same thing, but it might just land a little differently. So you said something earlier that I wanted to make sure to come back to too about how after experiencing this post traumatic growth that you have, you wouldn't forfeit the ability to empathize and the ability to like mirror other people's feelings that you can
Yeah.
now, which you are like, I love the case study of this, that you are so confirming something that I've seen when we think about high sensitivity. So a lot of people, I mean, highly sensitive people who make up to 30% of our population and probably over 30% of the listeners are going to be people who have more active amygdalas, which is our fear center and the center that lets us know if things are out of sorts in our environment, but
Yeah.
also more active mirror neurons. Now, this is the parts of our brain that help us literally kind of reflect and feel what the other person is feeling while they're feeling it, or even thinking about someone feeling something. Like I kind of laugh when I think about anytime I'm watching a movie or something, if the people and the characters are happy, I'll catch myself smiling. I'm like, why am I
Yeah.
smiling? I'm just like sitting on the couch. I must look like a
Right.
doofus. But
Yeah.
but when we think about trauma and how it actually does have the capability to change the brain,
Yes.
right? I would not be surprised if the parts of the brain that are designed for putting yourself in someone else's shoes, empathizing, because in a way, a lot of folks who have gone through this have to become vigilant to other people's feelings.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would suspect that the brain would become more sensitive. Maybe not someone who's born genetically highly sensitive, but in your own unique way, Molly, I feel like you've become more of a highly sensitive person as a result of your trauma.
Yes, I would agree with that. Sometimes to my demise. For example,
Oh,
like
it's not an easy thing to navigate
well,
every
right,
day.
yeah, because I find myself caring or feeling. I mean, just last week, I even have to be careful with how much I watch the news because
That is one of the
there
biggest
is,
things I suggest for
whew,
HSPs to be mindful of.
yes,
Hmm.
it is really difficult. I even just a couple of weeks ago, there was a story of a kid who got killed at a track meet by
Oh,
another
wow.
kid. It was on the national news, just
Hmm.
terrible. And
Yeah.
I like started crying watching it. I had to get up. My
Yeah.
husband's like, what's the matter? I'm like, I am literally like personalizing this, you know?
Yeah.
And he is like, you can't let this bother you. And I'm like, I know, but I can't help it, you know? And I
Right.
literally wrestled with it all night long.
Mm.
And, in that moment, I was like, man, I wish I wasn't feeling this so much. But at the same time, I am thankful for that quality
Yeah.
throughout this process because it has helped me find my calling, with what we're doing now. I was not
Right.
doing any of the work that I'm doing now before this happened. And my purpose was actually something that I always kind of struggled with. I
Yeah.
remember having conversations with my husband before this happened when my kids were younger, and I would say, like, I'm not really sure what it is that I'm here to do. Like, I know I'm here to be a mom. I know I'm here to be a wife, and I love that. That's the
Right.
best job in the world. But outside of that, like when my kids grow up and around a house, what am I going to do
Right.
with myself? You
Yeah.
know? And really, this tragedy in our life and this extremely difficult time, like, I hate to be cliche, but it's like rock bottom time in my
Right.
life brought me to my purpose
Yeah.
and allowed me to develop skills where I can help other people. And that has been a true gift. And for that, I would not change one thing that we've gone through. And that's an indicator of healing for me as well, that
Right.
I can say I wouldn't change it.
Mm. I mean, that's so truly powerful. And I think what you just described is part of what the process of unraveling generational trauma looks like, because what you are able to do now is probably model and show even heightened levels of empathy to your children who
Yeah.
will grow up more capable of embedding that into their future family.
Yes. Yes. I see that. And I think I remember when everything kind of capitulated and I just came to this, point where I said, because like you said, it's exhausting to
Yeah,
not talk about it.
right.
You're putting on a facade basically. And I
Hmm.
remember thinking, I'm done with that. Like I am going to just my kids know I mean, they were young at the time. They're 18 and 14 now, so they were young at that time. But even with them being young, they still see kids know and see and observe a lot more than we give them credit for sometimes. And
Hmm.
they knew that things were off. They knew that I wasn't in a good space. Lindsay wasn't in a good space. And I was like, I'm just going to be open with them about this. I'm going to
Yeah.
tell them that I'm working. I'm going to therapy. I'm going, they would see
Hmm.
me up in every single morning reading my Bible, doing my journaling. They would see me sometimes crying, and I would just say, mom's working through it, and this is my way.
Yeah,
And now, as
that's
they are
awesome.
getting older, yeah, it's been very rewarding because through their own struggles, they have come to me, and I see them tapping into tools that I've displayed to them, and that is
Right.
extremely rewarding. I'm like, okay, this is all worth something. Like if
Yeah.
they can learn healthy coping mechanisms and like you said, take that on to their own lives and eventually their own families, then I'm like, you know, nothing was wasted. It
Well,
was all good.
it's really neat too, because what you're talking about is the
Mhm.
difference. I think a lot of people struggle with, okay, how do I break generational trauma without putting my trauma on my child?
Right.
And what you just described is how to do it. Like, we're not displacing our traumas and expecting our child to caretake for us. Because I will say,
Right.
for anyone listening, the age or the kind of time in your life where you experienced a trauma, kind of like what you were saying, you were subconsciously ticking down the minutes and days
Yeah.
and hours to the age of 42, because that's when your uncle had passed and you saw
Yeah.
this catalyst of trauma in your family. It's very common, if we experience trauma at certain stages and our children reach that stage,
Yes.
that internal voice might worry about our child experiencing what we experienced, even if we're statistically or even looking at reality, there's really nothing that really points to it. So that's not a time to go to
Right.
our child and say, I was bullied in fifth grade. I'm really worried you're going to be bullied. Like, that's not what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
Right.
But
No, not at all.
right, no, that's not what
Mm-mm.
we're talking about. But to your point, for them to see that you have complex feelings that you're willing to admit and express when they arrive, that you show them you're doing something, and you even showed them, my feelings are here, they matter, and you're not responsible for fixing them.
Right.
That's
Right.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, we had a lot of conversations and I absolutely when I kind of made that shift of just like, you know what? I'm just going to be as transparent as possible, obviously
Right.
age appropriate at that time. And I'm just going to kind of let them in on this healing journey that I'm now doing.
Yeah.
Um, our relationship, my relationship with my two boys absolutely became closer. I felt a level of respect and affection from them that was just different. It was almost like I saw them empathizing with me and it was just this very beautiful thing of us becoming closer as I worked
Yeah.
to heal, as we all work to heal. It was,
Hmm.
and I am grateful for that experience because we all know that our kids are going to struggle with their own life at some point or another. I mean, this is
There's
just the human
plenty. Right.
experience, you know?
Yeah.
As much as we want to protect our kids, yeah, and keep them in a
Right.
bubble, that's not possible. And so, my hope and prayer through all of this has always been when they struggle, let
Yeah.
them know A, they can absolutely talk about it,
Right.
B, they have a mom that will understand, and C, these are the healthy ways to deal with that,
Right.
therapy, counseling, coaching.
Hmm.
They see me exercise has always been really important to me and I'll say to them, I exercise because it makes my head feel good, my mind feel good. Like
Right.
yeah, I love to be physically fit and strong and all those things, but the reason I exercise is because my head is so much healthier when I do. And so now I have a 14-year-old son that's in the gym all the time and he's like, "Yeah, I feel better when I exercise too."
That's
So
awesome.
these are just the little things that we can provide our kids, I feel like, that helps
Yeah.
break those patterns that have been in the family for years.
That's really neat too, because by you doing something like exercising, you're showing a post traumatic growth version of your tendency to flight. So,
Yes.
like, if someone feels that kind of busyness and they want to just be on the go and it's driven
Yeah.
by flight mode, but trauma response, moving your body is like the positive version of that. Or
Oh, yeah.
if you have a tendency to freeze, if that's something that is natural to you as a trauma response, and disclaimer, we don't get to choose our trauma response. So, to your
Right.
point that you said earlier in our conversation, if there's ever that tendency to self blame, because especially children or people who don't have control over what's happening around them, it can almost make more sense and the world can seem bizarrely safer if we think that we had something to do with why the trauma happened. But that's a distortion, that's not healthy and it's not true.
Yeah.
But if your tendency is to freeze, you can think, okay, well, maybe meditation is my thing. Or if
Yeah.
fight is your tendency, maybe joining a boxing ring, or I don't know,
Yeah,
getting into a debate club. Let me
right.
think for fawn. If you're a fawner, I don't know, maybe you become like a Reiki energy healer. I don't know,
Yeah,
something where you're just
right.
giving all your energy to other people. I
Hmm.
think it's about like seeing what has this trauma done to me, but what can it do for me?
Sure.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you one last question because I'm thinking about your kids the age they are now. What is
Yeah.
your thought on full disclosure and full honesty as your kids do become adults and as they're no longer kind of at the mercy of you being their sole everything, their sole provider? And if
Protector.
yeah, their
Yeah.
sole
Yeah.
protector, that's a good way of putting it. Like, what is your thought on like fully unveiling things?
Sure. My philosophy's kind of been if they come to me and ask the question, to answer it as
Right.
honestly as I can and to be as
Hmm.
transparent as I can. I feel like, you don't just go up to your kids and say, and sit them down and say, hey, so I want to talk to you about this situation that happened to me. Like you said, when I was in fifth
Yeah.
grade, I got bullied. So let's talk about bullying right now. I feel
Right.
like you kind of wait for those teachable moments.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something going on in their life
Right.
that triggers a conversation, and then you have an opportunity to share your personal experience.
Right.
I've seen that happen in my like with my kids over the last year or so as they've
Right.
navigated some of their own personal challenges, and while the situation is 100% different, it's given
Hmm.
me the opportunity to share a little bit more of what I went through and hey, do you remember when you saw me doing this? This is why. And
Right.
now that you're going through your own thing, you could implement that too. So I really feel like teachable moments are the key. I think
Hmm.
if we go to our kids and sit them down for a talk, or,
Right.
they can feel lectured and sometimes not
Right.
fully grasp, it's like, Mom, I don't want to hear another lecture, or here she goes
Yes.
again, like, but when it's authentic to what they're going through, and especially if there's been a question asked, that is your opportunity, in my opinion, to really share some golden nuggets
I
that
love
they
that.
can really take with them and apply,
Mm.
to their situation. For example, I can give you one example. My youngest went through just some growing pains last summer, all normal stuff, But I remember saying to him at that time, scripture has been hugely beneficial to me, just memorizing two or three that really just speak to me. And so I
Right.
said to him, I said, find something that speaks to you. Find a scripture that is
Right.
comforting and that encourages you and makes you feel just a positive shift. And so he did that. And his was Philippians 4:13, which is I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But I saw him kind of grasp onto that and apply that to
Right.
his own situation, and it was really helpful. So, just those little opportunities, I
Yeah.
think, to share.
I love that. I think it further affirms kind of our conversation earlier about not placing the trauma on the child, but being open and authentic about it
Right.
because it makes me think
Yes.
of maybe parents who had, for instance, alcoholism, for example, in their family. That's a conversation to
Hmm.
have at some point, letting your child know
Yeah.
because of its genetic nature, because of epigenetics and the way that it can, permeate different
Sure.
generations. But maybe it's not something you're sitting down and talking with your 5-year-old about. Maybe it's something that,
Right.
to your point, when perhaps it starts coming up with their peers or
Hmm.
I think I'm hearing you that when they come to you with a question, that's a full stop, that's a great time, but maybe also
Yes.
connecting with your intuition when you're seeing it showing up in their life, that
Hmm.
might also be a time to invite that kind of conversation. So
100%.
yeah,
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that.
And I think also too, we as parents, at least I have felt this pressure. I won't speak for everybody, but we kind of feel like the need to be perfect for our kids
Yeah.
and look like we have it all together. And I
Right.
have found that when I share with my children, this is where mom made a mistake.
Yeah.
Life was going along and I chose this path. And hey, it is what it is, but let me share this with you so maybe you can choose a little better.
Right.
Being open about the times that we've made mistakes, I think is hugely beneficial too. It's okay not to be perfect for our kids.
I
You
love
can go
that.
ahead and take that pressure off
Right.
yourself.
Well, because then
It's
they don't have to be
impossible.
perfect either. Like,
Exactly,
right?
100%. I had a coaching client about a year ago, and she was coming to see me, and she has a daughter, and she would bring her daughter up a lot in our sessions, and she would say, like, my daughter doesn't even know that I'm doing this work. And I said, why not?
Why?
I said,
Yeah.
this is the perfect thing to share with her. Her daughter was like 15, 16 years old. I said,
Right.
by sharing what you're doing for your own self, your daughter has a perfect like example template to follow.
Right.
She's going to have her own struggles. Whether if you want to admit it or not, she will
Yeah.
struggle. And if she knows that you've done this kind of work, then it's okay for her to do it, you
Yeah.
know?
It normalizes
So
it.
exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes almost to a fault. It's funny. The other day I was driving in the car and my 9-year-old goes, Mommy, why don't I have a therapist?
There you
I was
go.
like, do you want one?
Yeah. You will eventually.
So I know. So I
Yeah.
just thought it was funny. We kind of talked about reasons why, cause they know what I do for a living. So reasons
Sure.
why
Yeah.
people go. And I
Yeah.
let her know, if you ever want one, just let me know.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah, I
love
thought that
that.
was so
Yeah.
cute. But oh my gosh, Molly, I love talking to you. And I just feel like this was such a good follow-up to our first chat. And for anyone listening who didn't hear your whole story, going back to your other episode, I feel like it just kind of gives everyone the bigger picture of wow, to see what you went through and now where you are and where you
Yeah.
continue working on being is just so amazing. So
Thank you. I
I feel
appreciate that.
honored to know you now. I definitely want to stay
Oh,
connected. And
yeah.
as speaking of connection, how can people connect with you? Where can they look for you and the things that you offer and you put out into the world?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So my website is tattoosofmysoul.com. So the way I describe that is it's a faith-based motivational life coaching
Hmm.
company. So if you go to that website, you can read about my story there. There's a
Hmm.
video on about me or something like that, our
Yeah.
story. There's a blog. I do a podcast as well, which I think that you probably need to come and do my
Yeah. Oh
podcast.
my gosh. Yeah. Because we
Yes.
met on something different. So
We did. We
yeah.
did. Yeah. So we'll just keep collaborating.
Yes. I
I
love
do a
it.
newsletter. I have an online private Facebook group that's a prayer group.
Oh,
So
cool.
I really love to encourage people emotionally and spiritually. That's where I'm really passionate because those two
Hmm.
things have been the biggest
Right.
areas of help for me. And then obviously Facebook, Instagram. I'm probably mostly active on Facebook. You can just find me with my name, Molly Duncan. So
And I feel like your next thing, I'm imagining you having like a faith-based workout.
yeah, I like. Hey, working out is 100% spiritual.
You like
It
start it
totally
with
is.
prayer and then you do and then
Yes,
you like I don't know, just
that's a
ideas.
cool idea. I love that. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I have to bring my best friend in for that because
Yeah.
she's the workout queen. So I'm be like, okay, let's collaborate here.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Well, let me know.
Yes, yes.
So,
Okay.
all right. Well, thank you so much for coming. And
you.
if there was anything that we didn't cover that people had questions about, feel free to write in. We will definitely reach out and be well, everyone.